It's time for Declare Your Independence with Ernest Hancock.
Believe me when I say we have a difficult time ahead of us. But if we are to be prepared for it, we must first shed our fear of it. I stand here without fear because I remember that I am here not because of the path that lies before me, but because of the path that lies behind me. I remember that for 100 years we have fought these machines. And after a century of war, I remember that which matters most. We are still here! Tonight, let us make them remember we are not afraid!
Welcome to Declare Your Independence with me, Ernest Hancock, here in Phoenix, Arizona, from the beautiful studios of Freedom's Phoenix at the Farm. Now, today we're going to have a treat for a lot of you. I know that we're going to have a lot of questions on this, and we need to get an inside perspective on what's going on in Mexico with the drug war. Now, we have a gentleman, he's an author, John Gibler is a writer. He's based in Mexico and California, and he's author of the new book, To Die in Mexico, Dispatches from Inside the Drug War. Now, it's published by City Light Books, and it's just coming out. And he's also has Unconquered Chronicles of Power and Revolt. Now, this is a unique perspective that we're going to be able to learn from, because what's been going on, and we're here in Arizona, so the rest of the country may not be as privy to what's happening, and also how it's being, amped up by the politicians to advocate for more power that they want. But what's happening is there is a major drug war going on, where countless numbers of people are being found in mass graves. They are being killed. They're being executed. They're being wrapped up in blankets in the ditch, shot in the head, and this is getting to the point to where they're just a bunch of faceless bodies. And what has happened is sooner or later, someone of note, someone that's a loved one of somebody important, was going to die. And when that happened, here we go. And we get to talk about what are the real reasons behind this. And I'm glad to welcome John Gibler to the show to help us understand what's going on. Now, John, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about your book. I've read some articles that you've written. I've looked at some of the references to a lot of the stories that you covered, and I'm very surprised at what our rhetoric here in the U.S. is in regards to this. Can you please tell us about your book and what you're trying to accomplish?
Indeed. Thanks very much for having me on the air. It's a pleasure to be here and be in the airwaves, dear listeners in Phoenix, Arizona. The book, To Die in Mexico, is my attempt to step outside of the cops and robbers myths about the drug war and look into that world from an alternative angle. And really, one of the main, I think, most destructive myths, which you just hit on, about this whole thing, is that if you're found dead, wrapped up in a blanket and all that, there's an assumed logic that you were somehow dirty, that you thus in some way deserved it. And that assumed logic does two very destructive things. One, it justifies, in a sense, the government's total incapacity or refusal to actually investigate homicides. The Mexican government opens up investigations into less than 5% of the homicides that take place, which means that in the only past 4 years of this so-called drug war, more than 35,000 murders are not even being investigated. They're guaranteed impunity. And the second very destructive, socially destructive thing that this presumed guilt does is it creates a society that becomes numb to so much violence, so much death. You see the bodies on your television screens, newspaper headlines, and the photographs on the front page, or you hear about it on the radio, and you don't think about those bodies or that mass of death as anything related to human beings, people with families, people with lives and histories and dreams that were shattered, their families destroyed. And so one of the principal objectives in the book is to try and break that siege of anonymous death, of death without names, and look in from a side view and find out who are these people who are getting killed. So many of them simply have nothing to do with the drug trade. Of course, there are people who are involved, and even if they're involved, one supposes that we now live in societies with institutions of law where you should be guaranteed a fair trial, all of that, not a post-mortem death sentence, which is what is being inflicted in this war. And so one of the things I did in the book is I spent a lot of time traveling with, riding around with, talking with local Mexican journalists on the front lines of this drug war and profiling them, their lives, and then also highlighting their work, because they're the ones who really live there and who grew up there, raised their families there, and can, I think, discuss with incredible depth, detail, and complexity what's happening. So I ride with journalists in Ciudad Juarez, in Culiacan, Sinaloa, in Monterrey, in Mexico City, and in Reynosa, and try to tell the stories both of who they are and what it's like being a frontline journalist, a small local paper, a radio station in the front lines of the drug war in Mexico, but also all the stories they've uncovered that help kind of, again, break this idea of an anonymous massive death, victims without names, without histories, and look at the humanity and the particular stories behind all of these massacres, which end up revealing truths about the drug war, which are very, very different than what you hear, I think, on the majority of the mainstream news broadcasts, or especially from the government press releases.
Okay. You've given us a good start, and I want to read a little bit, and we'll get into the one case that has really brought this to the front. And let me ask you this, before I read this, what kind of coverage has your work gotten in the United States? And whatever it has gotten, from what political spectrum are you getting attention?
Most of my work is online or in small print media that tend to be on what's considered the left. A lot of my work right now gets the most coverage from community radio stations. That's where I do probably most of my work. I find that local reporters at community radio stations seem to have just more of a hunger to really talk about issues, and so they reach out, they call me up, see something I've written, and get me on the air.
A prominent individual, and we'll get into the details. John, help us with that when we come back. We're getting ready to go to the break. But I want you to know, you have a prominent individual's young son, that's 24, is just one of the faceless killed, and all of a sudden now we got somebody. And he is prominent enough that he is brought before President Calderon. Calderon has him come in, and the father had to leave from an event they was speaking at and a layover in Amsterdam. And he sees people buying and selling drugs legally. And there's no AK-47s, no dead bodies strung all over the place. There's no gangs, none of the prohibition disease that's going on there. And he talks to Calderon, he wants to meet with him and so on. And he tells Calderon that in Amsterdam, people would buy and sell drugs and they don't kill each other. What Calderon has done with his drug war is shameful, you write in the article, and has no pardon. Calderon would respond in so many words, "You're right, I was mistaken." But there's no turning back now. Why? When we come back, I want to talk about this, the end of prohibition, the end of unnecessary violence for plants. There is something else going on here. There is something else that is fueling this gangster mentality that's going. We went through this. It was called prohibition with alcohol. Did we learn our lesson? Or was it the lesson that we learned was how to use government and law enforcement and the drug kingpins to make a boatload of money and increase your power over people? Because if that's what they learned, They learned their lesson well, and how will we overcome it? We'll talk about that when we come back.